Hello, OJCS, and welcome to Story Time. Today we're going to be reading some books about cleaning, believe it or not. One is called Tidy, and one is called Sweep. And they are books about some characters who go a little too far when they try to clean. So I think these are great books, and I thank Maura Shira for recommending them for the library. And we're going to get started with reading them. Tidy by Emily Gravett. Deep in the forest lived a badger called Pete, who tidied and cleaned and kept everything neat. He tidied the flowers by checking each patch and snipping off any that didn't quite match. He tidied the fox by grooming his fur. He untangled each knot, each twig, and each burr. He tidied the birds, from the big to the small, by brushing their beaks and then bathing them all. He picked up stray sticks. He swept and he rubbed. He polished the rocks and he scoured and he scrubbed. Look at him, he's vacuuming the forest, everybody. If that's the weirdest thing you ever saw. So when a leaf fell, well, Pete tidied up, but still he wasn't happy. Now the trees look bare and scrappy, and so to make it all look neat, Pete undertook a mighty feat. He dug up every single tree. But then it rained. There was a flood. And afterwards, a lot of mud. Pete called in the diggers. He called in the mixers. He called in the concrete, the rakers, the fixers. No mud, no leaves, no mess, no trees. Perfectly tidy and perfectly neat. This forest is practically perfect, said Pete. It doesn't even look like a forest anymore. I'm hungry, he thought. I deserve a treat. So he hunted around for something to eat. But the beetles and worms that he usually found were under the concrete, deep in the ground. And so Pete decided to go home instead. If he couldn't have dinner, he'd go straight to bed. But when he arrived and took out his key, there wasn't a door where the door used to be. Later that night, Pete tossed and he turned. His belly was empty and it rumbled and churned. As he lay in his mixer, wide awake, he started to think, I've made a mistake. So, the very next morning when it got light, he set about trying to put everything right. Then the animals came from the strong to the weak, and they lent him a paw or a claw or a beak. They put everything back as it always had been, but maybe less ordered and not quite as clean. And Pete, well, he promised to tidy up less. But if he succeeded is anyone's guess. The end. That's a beautiful story. I love this story. And now this next one is called Sweep, and it's by Louise, Greig, and Julia Sarda. Ed in a good mood is a very nice Ed. Ed in a bad mood is not. And Ed was in a bad mood. Not one of those tiny whirlwinds in a teacup that blow over before they've even begun. No, this mood swept over him in a raging storm and stuck. It began as something small, really small, hardly anything at all. But before Ed knew it, the something had grown, gathered pace, and swept him off down a path. Ed's bad mood thought this was a wonderful idea, but the things that got in Ed's way did not. Ed knew perfectly well when he had gone far enough, but he could not bring himself to say, "Okay, that will do." So on he stormed a bit farther and a bit farther still, until suddenly the whole thing became bigger than him. Of course, if Ed had looked up, he would have noticed the beautiful things, the things that always made his heart sing. But he refused to lift his eyes. The ground was a lot more interesting, or so his bad mood told him. Everything seemed against him, but that just made him even more determined. He dug in his heels and kept going, just Ed and his bad mood. Is this really worth it, he asked himself. Yes, his bad mood decided, though Ed did wonder a little. Now his bad mood had swept through the whole town. The birds had stopped singing. The flowers had disappeared. The whole thing was affecting everyone and everything. Good, thought Ed's bad mood. But really, Ed was beginning to wish it had all blown over like a whirlwind in a teacup. Everything grew dark, and Ed was getting tired and hungry. He was finding it harder and harder to keep this up. Surely he could not give up now. Not when he had gone to all this trouble. That would be crazy. But something had to change. And then something did change. A new wind whipped up. It began as something small, really small, that became bigger, bigger than Ed. Suddenly, everything looked different. The world looked brighter. For a moment, Ed felt rather silly. Had he really gone to all that effort for nothing? But at least it had cleared the air. It had even blown something his way, something that made him look up. It lifted his mood higher and higher up to the sky. And suddenly he noticed beauty all around him. It swept him away. As for his bad mood, it vanished into thin air. Now, when it looks as if Ed might spiral into a bad mood and sweep down that path again, he thinks twice. His first thought is, will I? And his second thought is, or not. I really love that story because it shows us that we have the choice about what kind of mood we're going to be in. And even if we don't feel great, we don't have to let it overwhelm us. So that's a beautiful story, and I really loved it. So I will post an activity below this video, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.